Okay, welcome back to the channel, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. How's everything in the United States with you?
Peachy.
What did that mean?
Well, it means everything is good, which I'm being facetious, as we say, or
Okay,
not too serious.
uh, let's start off with this. Last time we spoke, we talked about the conflict between NATO, proxy war, Ukraine, Russia, and so forth. Let's start off where we left. There's some information figuring, going around that some of the weapons designated to be sent to the Ukraine from both US and I guess from Great Britain and others, West, is being redirected to go to Israel. Let's start off with that. What's your opinion about that?
Well, you understand, and I'm sure your viewers are aware that we have sent almost all of our war stocks in many weapon systems and ammunition to Ukraine, with the result that we don't have a great deal left. And it was decided that given Israel's precarious situation right now, and it is precarious, by the way, that they needed whatever 155 millimeter ammunition we had, plus other types of ammo. And I think it's also reflects something else. The war in Ukraine is lost. It was lost a long time ago. The Russians are sitting on virtually all the territory that is Russian historically, except for Kharkov and Odessa, which they will undoubtedly move to take at some point in the near future. But for the moment, they're not advancing very, very quickly to the West because they simply don't want to govern Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm.
What they would like is an end to the war. They'd like to have a Ukraine on their border that is neutral and not aligned with NATO. It's very simple.
Yeah.
And everyone in NATO continues to resist this idea, except for obviously Erdogan, who is technically in NATO, but more important, Hungary.
Yeah.
Now Slovakia seems to be
Right.
signed on. And I expect the Poles will come around to the same conclusion that it's time to end this war. I think Europe is in the middle of a swing to the right. I think we're going to see a new German government at some point in the near future that is to the right of center. And I suspect that will happen across Europe because it's a matter of survival for Europe, for reasons internal to Europe. But the war in Ukraine is effectively over. We continue to send money there, keep Ukraine on life support, because people in Washington refuse to admit that this has been a horrible mistake.
Mm.
That our interference in this matter has caused the deaths of at least 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And how many wounded is anybody's guess.
Yeah.
And almost half the population is either out of the country, wounded, dead, or sitting under Russian control right now.
Yeah.
So it's a terrible situation.
Yeah.
The sooner the better for everybody.
Yeah.
But again, no one wants to admit they made a mistake, and we can't afford it. We're piling up debt at a rate that boggles the mind. No one can even believe the levels of debt that exist in the United States, and I suspect we will continue to do that until we implode financially, which I'm not sure is that far off.
Yeah. Well, the same thing is in the European Union. I mean, there's 600 billion euros being sent to various war efforts, mostly Ukraine. And that is all taken up as loans, which has an interest to be paid back. And right. You and I know who are doing this. The banks and the war industry. They're making money. I heard an interview with one of the executives of Raytheon. He spoke to a person that it was redacted that actually had recorded it. He said, well, we'll increase our profits with 4 billion as long as the Ukraine war persists. And now with the conflict in Israel, we'll add another 5 billion to our profits. So there are, of course, people profiting from military conflicts, and that's always been that way. Uh, if we go back to the Middle East, I mean, that is such a complicated issue. But what do you think? How will this conflict play out? I saw just today that they're actually going in with ground forces from Israel into Gaza. How do you think it will play out? Is there an end to that? What do you think?
This is the time to strike decisively against Hamas based on the excesses of Hamas's behavior when it attacked Israel on the 7th of October.
Right.
And obviously, those attacks horrified everyone who witnessed them. No one disputes that. But I think his assumption was, I can now use public sympathy for Israel to justify whatever I want to do against Hamas. And whatever he wants to do has turned out to be as his view is, this is the time to annihilate Hamas, and along with it, whatever population supports it or hides it, and as much of Gaza as possible. Mm-hmm. He's miscalculated badly because he doesn't understand that this notion of collective punishment that involves the deaths at this point of almost 3,500 children and 6,000 plus civilians is not acceptable anywhere in the world. The other thing is that despite their efforts to suppress media coverage of Gaza in the Arab world or the Muslim world, it's overwhelming. And virtually the entire Islamic world at this point, from Morocco to Indonesia, is horrified and wants to stop this.
Yeah.
We are sitting there and we are effectively under control of the Israeli government for all intents and purposes. We've signed on 100%. This is something that Israel's supporters in the United States have cultivated with billions of dollars over many, many years, to the point where there's virtually no one in the United States government who's willing to stand up and say there is a limit to what we Americans will tolerate or do. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, most Americans really don't understand what's happening over there. They're not terribly interested, and they don't understand the dangers. Right. So Mr. Netanyahu says, I can leverage American military power to do pretty much whatever I want, and they'll protect my northern flank. That's why you've got the carrier battle groups out there. We've moved B-52s into the region. And his assumption is this additional American naval and air power can be used against Hezbollah while he finishes the job in Gaza. There are problems with these assumptions. First of all, this is not the Middle East of 1973, the last time the Israelis fought a really major war in the region. At that point in time, literacy in Egypt was perhaps 40%. The ability to master and employ technology was minimal. The situation in Jordan was a little better, but not much. And of course, Syria failed miserably because it too lacked the technical skills and the ability to do a great deal. He's no longer dealing with just his neighbors. Now he has to confront the real possibility that Turkey could actually attack Israel.
Exactly.
And Israelis have not taken that seriously. I think numbers of Israelis regard Mr. Erdogan, as frankly many in Washington, as a blowhard. I think that's a very serious mistake. I think that Mr. Erdogan may be many things, and certainly a very clever political figure who knows how to navigate the tough waters of the Middle East and Europe, but he is not a blowhard. And the Turkish armed forces are exceptional. They're tough, they're well-equipped, and the population itself is overwhelmingly in support of action against Israel. To Turkey, you must add, of course, the Iranians. The Iranians can't project much conventional military power very far from their borders, but they have an extraordinary arsenal of missiles. They have a very complicated and complex and effective air and space system that they've built over many, many years. They pulled together the best human capital in their country, excellent engineers, very imaginative and innovative. They pose a real threat to the Israelis. If you look at the range of their weapons, their theater ballistic missiles, which are now very accurate and very lethal, that number in the hundreds, can reach out to about 1,200 miles.
Yeah.
1,200 miles, more than sufficiently covers Israel. And
exactly.
Israel can turn to its Iron Dome, but any air and missile defense system can be overwhelmed by numbers of missiles hurled at it.
Yeah.
And we haven't even talked about the missiles and rockets that Hamas can obviously fire that would absolutely destroy northern Israel. So
Yeah.
my concern very early on was that Mr. Netanyahu and his government have miscalculated. They don't realize that the entire region is now united against them. I mean, you have the two great Islamic powers,
Mm.
Sunni Turkey and Shiite Iran, who under normal circumstances are almost at each other's throats, who now are willing to cooperate to
Mm.
destroy Israel.
Yeah.
I've been urging people in the United States to come to terms with this reality, particularly in Washington, because Israel could ultimately emerge from this war in ruins and effectively cease to exist.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody understands that. Israel's very survival as a nation on the map in the region is open to question now, which was
Mm.
not true in the past. However serious the odds were against Israel, Israel enjoyed enormous advantages in terms of its technology, its human capital, and of course, American backing. We too are very limited. The problem in the United States is that people have not come to terms with the reality that this is not 1991. Not only do we not have the forces that we had in 1991, we have really deteriorated dramatically in terms of our military power.
Mm-hmm.
We have trouble recruiting for our armed forces for reasons that are internal to the United States. People are unhappy with these diversity, inclusion, multicultural programs with which you are familiar.
Yes.
So, Americans, red-blooded Americans have said, to hell with this. I don't want to be part of it. So it's very hard to recruit. And of course, demographically, our population has changed. So
Mm-hmm.
we're probably on a good day, if we're lucky in terms of sheer numbers, we're 60% Americans of European extraction. And
Mm-hmm.
back in 1991, we were probably 85% or 80% Americans of European extraction. So immigration, legal and illegal, has had a profound impact here.
Yeah.
We no longer have a body of Americans who can agree on very much. In fact, we're divided here in the United States. So
Yeah.
I have bad feelings about this. I think Israel has picked the wrong time to attack and try to eliminate the people in Gaza. I think it's going to
Mm.
backfire badly on. We haven't even mentioned Egypt.
Yeah.
Egypt is so important because Egypt has maintained good relations with Israel.
Yeah. And they also
Current,
have control over the Suez Canal.
yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, we have to reckon that once this thing blows up regionally, we'll lose access to both the Straits of Hormuz and to the Suez Canal. And every month, 20% of the world's oil supply
Yep.
passes through the Straits of Hormuz, and 25% of the world's liquefied natural gas supply moves through those straits. Bottom line is there's no good news here for us.
No.
We don't benefit at all. The United States and Europe at severe risk of all of this. And then, of course, your very large Muslim populations in your country are a catalyst for real conflict because they are universally allied or aligned with their co-religionists, if you want to call them that, in the Middle East and Africa. And I don't see any good news. So I would like to see a ceasefire. I would like to see the great powers come together and try to resolve this, but there's no leadership in Washington to do that. None.
No. Nor in the United Nations Security Council. They had a resolution proposal that was basically voted not approved. They wanted a ceasefire resolution. 120 of the member states said, yeah, we want it, but enough, I think it was 45, said no. And Sweden, of course, put down their vote, didn't vote at all. So I'm really pleased to hear that. If we go to this, do you think if this conflict in the Middle East continues and the United States get more involved in it, Uh, is there a risk of a real war, a regional war? And then we're talking about the Muslim united world against the U.S., the West, and Israel. Is that a risk? What do you think?
Well, the problem right now is that we don't have much to send beyond what we've already sent. What there is of our small army of perhaps 450,000, the combat power, the punch, if you will, of that army is sitting in Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania. Mm-hmm. What we have to send right now are some light forces that in that part of the world are at high risk. We have, for instance, 1,000 American soldiers in eastern Syria, sitting on Syrian territory illegally, I might add. And they're at very high risk because
they were attacked also, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. But they're entirely dependent upon U.S. air power because they themselves have very little staying power. A friend of mine in the Pentagon was talking to me, and he compared our position in eastern Syria to Wake Island in the Pacific in 1941 and 42. Most of your viewers will not know what that is, but that's a small island north and a little far west from Hawaii. And we lost all the soldiers or Marines that were on Wake Island. And at the time, people were saying, well, we've got to reinforce Wake. We've got to send ships out there. And people said, well, if you do that, you'll just lose the soldiers or the Marines and you'll lose the ships. So ultimately, the men put up a good fight, but they were all taken prisoner. And that was a disaster for us. Well, we also had a disaster in the Philippines because, again, these places were too far for us to reach in a timely manner to save. Mm-hmm. Well, things haven't changed that much geographically. No. If you try to move vast distances across the Middle East on the ground to reach your troops in Syria, you're not going to get there soon enough to make any difference. Mm-hmm. You get there at all. And again, what are we going to send? Someone also mentioned to me recently, well, perhaps it's time for a draft.
Yeah.
I don't see any evidence that anyone in the United States would support such a thing because they would not regard this as justifying a draft. Mm-hmm. We had President Biden who gave this, what I consider to be utterly ridiculous speech to the American people and compared today's situation with 1941 after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Talking to us as though this is the great moment. We Americans can do anything. We can spend as we need. We can afford everything. And we are invincible and invulnerable. Well, I've got news for everybody. We're not. And then, of course, right, there's more talk right now about attacking Iran than there is about Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah.
Yeah.
In other words, talk about, as we say in English, putting the cart in front of the horse. There is this passion in Washington war with Iran. And again, Iran is not the Iran of 30 years ago.
No.
Iran is much more capable now. And behind Iran stands Russia.
Yeah.
Russia is not going to abandon Iran.
They're not going to sit still and just observe this.
This is something else we don't get.
Yeah.
They're not going to allow it. And, the Russians will counsel restraint. I think President Putin has already done that with Mr. Erdogan. But the Russians aren't going to throw themselves in front of the onrushing train. They're going to say, well, this is happening, and we're not going to allow certain things that are in our interest to happen. In other words, we won't let the Americans destroy all of these countries. Then standing behind Russia is China, whose principal goal is not war, but to do business. Mm-hmm. And China is desperately trying to expand this One Belt, One Road project.
Right.
We keep portraying China as this aggressive military power. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Chinese depend for their very lives on commerce, for the influx of food and oil and resources from Africa and the Middle East into China. They don't want to put their sea lanes at risk, and they're very heavily dependent upon Russian resources, so they don't want Russia destroyed. So what do you do if you're Chinese? Well, you stay out of it, but you support as much as possible the people under attack. So I don't see any good news for us. No one has thought this. There is no end state that we point to that serves our interests or Israel's.
Yeah, there's no exit favorable. I thought about what you said there, and endless resources. Wasn't it Victoria Nuland that was made a statement recently where she said, we can afford all of this. We can afford billions and billions to support our cause in various wars. Uh,
Well,
this time,
actually, it was Janet Yellen,
yeah, it was okay. Yeah,
Secretary of the
right.
Treasury. Yes, and she's a neocon colleague
Yeah.
of Newland's making these outrageous statements. I think the neocons in the United States share Netanyahu's agenda insofar as they think this may be their last opportunity to reorder the Middle East in a way that favors their worldview and Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's a very interesting sort of perspective that we're looking at the world and we see how dramatically it has changed over the last 50 years, but they don't see it that way.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to think that we, backing Israel, allied with Israel, working with Israel, fighting for Israeli interests, will change a region in our favor.
Yeah.
I don't see any evidence for that. I see the opposite occurring.
No, it's what we can see. I mean, we spoke, I think, before we started recording, in Scandinavia, there's very many, there's a lot of Muslims, and they have a say so because there's such a big portion of the population since the immigration, the transfer of people up to Northern Europe mostly. So they're not scoring any points at all.
Well, it would be useful. It would be useful for Europeans to understand that if you landed 100,000 European Christians in Saudi Arabia, in North Africa, somewhere in the Middle East or North Africa, the local populations would kill them.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you wave a HBTQ flag, you'll be executed immediately.
Well, it's not just that. It's just these countries will not tolerate the presence of people inside their own societies who are so radically different. Real question is, why are you doing it?
Yeah.
They won't tolerate us. Why are you tolerating them?
Yeah.
And I think this is a question that has to be answered before Europe sinks into the abyss. And there's a real danger that that could happen.
Well, some people around me, I'm considered a right-wing extremist by Swedish media because we have a monopoly on the media, which is leftist and globalist, all of them, plus a state-controlled national television channel that is tax-funded, forcibly funded by tax money, 9 billion Swedish kroners a year to produce propaganda, which is what they're doing. We usually, sometimes I've said, if you import the Middle East to Sweden, you'll get the Middle East. And then the media goes, oh, this guy's crazy. No. But that's the way it is.
I mean, we've got a similar problem insofar as the people that have been pouring into our country, certainly illegally and to some extent legally over the last 30 years, are not really interested in becoming Americans.
No.
So what you end up with are islands of foreign culture, foreign people, foreign thinking inside your country. And I think that's what's happened in Europe. We're dealing with a similar problem. We're a very large country. And so there are many parts of America that don't feel this, which is another issue for us. Again, I can't to tell Europeans, most Americans on any given day could care less what happens beyond the borders of their country. Exactly. It just doesn't matter to them. But now we're faced with very serious financial circumstances and conditions. Our economy is far weaker than it has ever been, certainly in the last 30, 40 years.
Right.
These things are going to converge with the overseas crises in ways that are going to produce serious turmoil and conflict inside the United States. So the notion that we can fight an open-ended war in the Middle East or anywhere else that's designed to change that part of the world while we sit here comfortably is simply deranged. Yeah. That makes no sense. It's absurd.
Yeah. I spoke to a Norwegian lady on a program yesterday, She comes from the socialist sort of left wing, but retired from that and started a movement that she called Peace and Justice. And they're also in Great Britain, and they're cooperating with us. It's not started in Sweden. And I got criticized for, why do you talk to a communist? No, I'm talking to a lady that wants peace and justice and stop this ludicrous warmongering that's going on. And of course, Norway's been one of the original NATO members, which is understandable since they were occupied by Hitler and Germany during World War II. So they joined in 1947, I believe, as one of the original 12. But this lady she sees no advantage of Norway staying. She says NATO has to be dissolved in the same way that the Warsaw Pact was in conjunction with the Berlin Wall fell and Russia collapsed, or Soviet Union, I should say, collapsed. So she had a point, a really good point. So I will bring her on the show one more time, possibly in the future, because it goes against the narrative of calling me a right-winger, because I bring in people with other backgrounds politically. So,
well, you have a similar phenomenon, obviously, with Wagenknecht in Germany, and her views on foreign and defense policy, and also, I think, the Alternative für Deutschland. They do have a convergence of interest, and we live in republics, whether they're parliamentary or otherwise, in which you would hope that parties on the left and the right can find common ground.
Yeah.
I see this as essentially positive, but you're dealing with the last vestige of this post-war liberal order.
Mm-hmm.
And this thing came about as a result of the Second World War. We all understand that. Well, the Second World War has long since ended, and more important, the most important legacy of that war was the Soviet occupation of half of Europe and a large part of Asia. That too has fallen apart. It's gone. Yeah. And at the time that it fell apart, most of us in NATO, I would say most of the Americans and certainly almost all the European officers that I dealt with felt strongly that NATO should be a force that is there to ensure there are no more wars in Europe.
Right.
That's what we thought the thing was kept in existence.
Yeah, well, it was, to prevent history repeating itself, basically keeping Germany out of the possibility of starting something similar to what Hitler did. That was the idea, a peace alliance, an insurance policy.
Well, I think the Scandinavians continue to worry too much about the Germans. And I would argue that the Second World War in Scandinavia needs a re-examination. Mm-hmm. There is not much truth in what is stated about the Germans during the Second World War in Scandinavia. But beyond that, the problem is that now this has switched to this absurd picture of Russia as a vicious, evil dictatorship. It might as well be Hitlerite Russia now. And Russia is not Hitlerite, and it certainly isn't communist. And I see no evidence that the Russians have any interest whatsoever in occupying Norway.
No.
Or anybody else in Eastern Europe, because it's bad for business.
Exactly.
Territorial imperialism is a loser.
Yeah.
That's why it went out of business. That's why everybody eventually abandoned the colonies. Just asked somebody today. I was with some Nigerian officers a few years ago, and these Nigerian officers said to me, Colonel Macgregor, do you think we could persuade the British to come back here and rule us for another 20 years? We need help. And I looked at them. I said, no. And I don't think you're going to find anybody in Great Britain that wants to go back. This is all nonsense now.
Yeah, I know.
It needs to end. And we need to stop looking at the Russians through this bizarre lens that is being created in the media.
Yeah.
Keep in mind the same people who are arguing for the destruction of Russia are very much the same people who now want to destroy Iran that are living in Washington. Yeah. I mean, it's unmistakable.
Yeah.
And people need to wake up and figure out there's something radically wrong here, because this very well-financed minority of elitists in Washington, maybe perhaps in your part of the world as well,
Yeah.
are driving all of us into wars that we really don't need to fight and certainly don't want to fight.
No. Sweden's eagerness to join NATO switched from, a year and a half ago from saying no to we must. And of course, we have a very influential family. Their name is Wallenberg, and they own pretty much most of the war industry. Sweden has always had a formidable. We have formidable fighter jets, weapon systems of our own. About five or ABB is a big company. Ericsson Communication owns big parts of Raytheon, General Dynamics, and are involved in this industry. So my personal opinion about the switch from staying neutral that Sweden has been for 200 years plus to suddenly lobby to get into NATO and applying and trying everything they have to convince people that this is a good idea. Of course, Viktor Orban in Hungary and Erdogan in Turkey has been a bit reluctant to let Sweden in for religious reasons when it comes to Turkey, and for Orban's nationalism that's been criticized by the Swedish government, saying that he is not a democratic country. And that has pissed him off. And whereas he says, no, I will not approve Sweden's NATO application.
Well, there are two things that are worth mentioning. First of all, Swedes and Finns both need to ask themselves the following question. Having been neutral now for a very long time, how has that worked out?
Has that worked out just great?
Yeah. Has that been a disaster? Has it harmed Sweden or Finland? So if it hasn't, the question is, why change it?
Exactly.
That's the first thing. The second part of this, and I think this is very important, when Eisenhower was president, he made several statements at the time that NATO was growing and expanding in the 1950s. He said, first of all, if NATO still exists 10 years after I leave office, he left office in 1960, well, then we failed.
Mm-hmm.
We have failed. We don't want this alliance in perpetuity, and we don't want U.S. forces in Europe in perpetuity. Right. In other words, Europe should stand on its own, and within 10 years, we should reach a better arrangement with the Soviets. Right. He subsequently wanted to use Austria and its neutrality as a model for most of Eastern Europe, because he said, first of all, we can't defend all of these places. We don't have the resources.
Right.
It's better for them to be neutral. If they're neutral, that reduces the burden on us, and it restricts the areas that we have to defend if we ever have to go to war, which privately, I don't think he believed would be the case.
No.
Now, I think Eisenhower, in retrospect, was right. And I also think Eisenhower understood, because he had been through this terrible war. And he said over and over and over again privately, he said, we Americans can never fight another war like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just beyond our ability. We could never do what the Germans and the Soviets did in terms of sustaining losses and fighting. Impossible.
Mm.
Our business as Americans is to promote prosperity.
Yeah.
Not war.
Exactly. To do business.
We have gotten out of the business of promoting prosperity. It used to be, if you want prosperity at home, you need peace abroad.
Yeah.
We have taken the position now that our prosperity depends to some extent on war, which I think is fundamentally wrong. But if you look at our manufacturing base, which large numbers of very wealthy people in the United States in the 90s and late 80s exported to China for personal profit and gain, most of our so-called manufacturing that has any real export value tends to be military.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why our President Trump, who was so unpopular in Europe, was desperate to repatriate industry back to the United States to reduce our dependence on scientific, industrial, military power.
Yeah.
And also to, promote employment and change the focus and direction of economic development. We still need to do that. But I'm afraid that at this point, the only way we're going to get there is to go broke.
Yeah.
And we're close. We're very close. Europeans don't understand this. The American brand in people's minds is still very strong in Europe. I get this all the time. Americans, they can do this. Americans can do it. I don't think they understand that we, like the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, are close to financial catastrophe.
Yep.
I always ask the same question when people say to me, well, do you think the Americans will stay here for another 50 years? And I say, when did the British leave India? And they all look at me strangely. And I said, when their debt to GDP ratio was 240%, because they bankrupted themselves.
They couldn't afford to stay in India. That's it.
But they bankrupted themselves in World War II.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you go back and look at the British focus at the time, they were worried about their empire, not you.
Exactly.
Because India was the big source of revenue. Yep. And so they thought in terms of how do we protect the empire and fight the war in Europe on the cheap? It didn't work. We bankrupted them, the United States. We brought down the British Empire. And nobody understands that. I think maybe some of the British do today, but the truth is we're doing it to ourselves now. And it's coming to an end. So Europeans really need to stop and look inwardly and think carefully about where do you want to end up at the moment, but we're simply no longer there because we cannot afford it. All this talk from Yellen is nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah, but the European Union is going the same way, unfortunately. They don't realize that now they're trying to call up another 500 billion kroners in deficit because there's a budget negotiation now, what they're going to do with the tax money in Europe until 2027, which is the coming period for their spending. And there's a deficit everywhere, and it's all based on credit. It's based on loans, created money. So,
and the other thing that Europeans need to keep in mind is our experience with people inside the United States who were not Americans. In 1929, when the stock market crashed, and in the years that followed, President Hoover signed an executive order deporting 9 million Mexicans. Now, did we deport the 9 million Mexicans because we don't like tacos and burritos and because we don't like their music and we don't like Mexicans? No, had nothing to do with it. We deported them to open up jobs for Americans who needed employment. Now, the subsequent presidents deported another 5.5 million Mexicans, all the way up through Eisenhower. Yeah. Again, it was a sensitivity to employment at home, prosperity at home. What are you going to do, and what are we going to do when the economy shrinks? And we're headed in that direction here. I don't know about the situation where you are, but I know
it is similar. It might not be at the same level. But I mean, I remember the story. I visited New York City many times, and I've been up in the Empire State Building several times and read about the history, why it was built so quickly, because the unemployment was so horrendous. Every morning, there were thousands of willing Americans standing in line to get a chance to work on the build every day. And it was finished in no time, a year and a half or something like that. It was scheduled to take 4 or 5 years because of after the 1929 disaster on the stock market and the economy in general. So economy goes in cycles, and obviously it's controlled by incompetent people governing tax money. That is a strong thing in Europe, since we have a higher tax pressure than the United States, and have always had. And especially like Denmark and Sweden is like 60%. Really, it's 80% when you calculate in all the taxes on gas, sales tax, 25% sales tax, 80% tax on gas, 80% tax on tobacco and alcohol. So it's really high. And if it's managed properly, that's not a problem, but it isn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, your leadership, your so-called ruling elites, political elites, are similar to ours.
Yeah.
In one sense, that's very important. When we look at history, the American, because we're a relatively new nation, tends to view history as this steady, uninterrupted ascent to greatness, to greater power, greater prosperity, greater wealth. And I think you've caught that particular disease, whereas your preceding elites historically understood that history really is very cyclical. And what they understood was that there are times when you are peaking and times when you are not, when you are moving downward. You want to protect yourself against the downward trends so that you can resume a better path into the future. All of the great powers of the 19th century understood that. Whether it was Austria-Hungary or Germany or Russia, they understood this is a cyclical problem. We have to learn to live with it and deal with it. We've forgotten that because we never knew it. Mm-hmm. We don't see any cycles. It's just
well, you have 1929.
Yeah, but that's sort of dismissed out of hand as an anomaly. And so, well, that was, and that'll never happen again. Yeah, well, stand by. We like to say we have never defaulted. But in 1934 and in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt, in fact, did it. He defaulted. What he did is he sent his representatives to our creditors and said, we can't get on with life paying the kind of installments that you are demanding. If you will adjust our payments, we can do better. And so we restructured our debt. So the notion that we've never had a problem is wrong. Now, the only way we can survive this and restructure our debt is that if we're willing to cut spending, because the creditor wants to see evidence that you're willing to do what is necessary to put your government and your society on a sound financial footing. Well, there's no evidence for that. We'll cut anything. We're spending more now. I mean, somebody said we pile another 1.5 trillion in debt on top of everything we have just within the last few months. I mean, this is insane. This cannot go on.
It'll come to an end somehow. All right. We've been over time now. So I know you have a busy schedule, Colonel. So if you have a final saying, my final saying is thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy schedule and show up on this minuscule Swedish channel. But I do have a few viewers that appreciate these programs. So,
well, do what you can to persuade your government of the criticality of urging a ceasefire and peace, however unhappy that may make the Israelis or anyone else. Because if we can get a ceasefire, perhaps we can derail the train which is headed to a regional war, which I see as being fundamentally antithetical to our interests as well as everyone in the regions. And the second thing is that we Americans have tended to forget that your first rule of strategy is that you must always maintain your power, your strength, your independence. If you fail to do so, you become hostage to the fortunes of others, and ultimately you may lose everything. Again, going back to the world that existed before 1914, that's something Europeans understood and did it very effectively. We're not doing it right now, and as a result, our country is headed into a very serious crisis. So I hope you can profit from those two things. And Sweden has always had the reputation for being an advocate for peace.
Exactly.
An advocate for resolution of conflict and a willingness to engage to do that. I would welcome that again.
Yeah, I would too. And I'll keep on fighting over here on my end. Thank you very much, Colonel. And I'll sound like a Canadian. I'll say good day.
Okay. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Bye.